has been a bit of a warm-up. We're now going to start dealing with like real public policy issues rather than just sort of like technical stuff that you need to know in order to think about them. In particular, we'll start talking about market failures and their solutions. So we'll go through the idea of an externality, which is a missing market price and means some social cost or benefit is ignored that should be taken into account. And we'll talk about why, to solve these, the intervention should be targeted as specifically as possible at the problem that it's trying to address, rather than at something that's obliquely related to it. By the way, all the lectures are now up to date online, so if you guys want to review them, they're all online, up to date. We'll then talk about some surprising externalities and some surprising things that are not externalities, which will help you develop a sense for what is and is not really an externality. We'll talk about pecuniary externalities and what are called internalities, which are externalities within a person. We'll then talk about public policy solutions to externalities, Pavilion taxes, cap and trade, and the legal system. And we'll then talk about trade-offs between these different types of approaches. We'll then turn to Stigler's Coase theorem and private bargaining solutions to externalities. The idea that when property rights are well defined, parties may be able to bargain to efficiency. And we'll talk about some cases where that's the case. But then I'll try to highlight the fact that actually that's a pretty flawed way of thinking about things, and that actually in most cases, private parties don't really have enough information to bargain to efficiency, and that even if they did, that the intervention wouldn't make things worse. And that in fact, much of the reason why we think things are externalities is because the private people don't have the information, and you need some sort of a government intervention to collect the right information. So, why did we find that the market mechanism worked so well in our lectures on perfect competition and so forth? Well, the basic reason is, if I want to eat more fancy dinners, I have to pay for that. Right? Anytime I want something, I have to pay for that. And anytime I do something that helps other people, like help build a table or build a bridge, I get paid for that. Right? So every time I impose a cost on other people, I pay the opportunity cost to them of that. And every time I bring a benefit to people, I get paid for that. And this principle is called payments in accordance with product. Whatever consequences I have for other people is what I have to pay or get paid. And anytime this fails to happen, anytime there's a cost for which I don't have to pay, or a benefit for which I don't get paid, we say that there's an externality to it. There's a missing price. Because it's external to the price system. So that's what an externality means. And Patrick, Lou? Patrick?
Yeah.
What are some examples of externalities?
Pollution.
Yeah, pollution's a great example. Or playing loud music that drives your neighbors crazy. Building a beautiful building that everyone likes to look at. Generating new ideas that other people can use. Crime. All these things are externalities, positive or negative. So a simple example is smoking. So imagine that there's 100,000 people in downtown Chicago each day, and 10% are smokers, and it's worth each of them 3s minus s squared dollars to smoke s cigarettes. And cigarette price is $1 before they impose a tax. How much will the smokers smoke? Reping. Reping, what's your name? Leo, what's You can come up and do it on the board if you prefer. Come on. Everyone wanted to use the chalkboard. You're going to have to use the chalkboard too, not just me. So, it's worth to each guy 3 S minus S squared to smoke S cigarettes, and the price is $1. How much are they going to smoke? Yeah. What's the marginal value that they get? So if this is the total value they get from smoking S, what's the marginal value that they get? Exactly. And then if the price is $1, how much are they going to smoke? Okay, so you said the marginal value equal to the price, right? So what are they going to smoke? So it's 10, right? Yeah, that's right. Well done, yeah. So they're going to smoke 10 cigarettes, right? Now imagine that the other 90% of people who aren't smoking get a disutility of 1 over $100,000 from each cigarette that's smoked. What would be the socially optimal amount of smoking? Songping? What's the socially optimal amount of smoking?
So you have to find.
You can do it on the chalkboard if you want. So there's 90,000 people, each who get a disutility of 1 over 100,000 from every cigarette that's smoked.
So with this utility be 9%.
Yeah, that's right. And right, that should be subtracted from the value that the person gets privately, right? Because he's not taking into account that, and he should be taking into account that.
So it's 3S minus S squared.
Well, you could just do it with the marginal values, right? Because the marginal cost to everyone of 1 more cigarette being smoked is always 90 cents, so you could just subtract that from there. Yep. Yeah. Minus 1 minus 0.9, right? 1.1, that's right. Exactly right. Well done. So everyone should be smoking 5.5 cigarettes rather than 10. So the problem is smokers don't have to pay for the harm that they cause by smoking. And today we're going to talk about various different ways we can make them pay for that and achieve efficiency as a result. Okay. So to just put this graphically, actually Amanda, why don't you come and put this, try to draw a graph of this situation. It can be either this specific example or sort of more broadly just. So what are those two curves? You're drawing the right things, but just to clarify what those two curves are.
Like, in a sense, supply and demand.
Or you could call them, this is the marginal social cost, external cost of the externality, right? This is the cost to people other than the people involved, and this is the private benefit,
Okay.
right? Because this could combine supply and demand. It's the difference between supply and demand, basically.
Okay. And then, like, the externality would be...
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. So the externality, like the optimal level of the tax, would be wherever those curves intersect with each other. Okay. So more generally, there could be lots of different people, and different people could be harmed different amount by the smoking. So it's not necessarily that everyone's exactly the same. What we need to take into account is the total external harms that are caused. And we have to add that up over all the harm that is done, and this is Pagu's principle of payments in accordance with product. So everyone should pay the average externality caused by their actions. And this is not just economics, this is common sense, right? Our common sense notions of fairness and justice say that if I do something that hurts other people, I should have to pay for that, right? And that's exactly what markets do, right? As we explained, markets make you pay if you want, something. If you want to attend the University of Chicago, which makes me get up here in front of you and drive you crazy, then you should have to pay for the privilege of doing that, right? And if externality policy tries to do this, tries to fix this problem, that you're not paying in cases where markets are missing. And this is basically the only way to ensure that you have the right incentives. Now, solutions to the externality problem, Pagu's principle says, should be focused as narrowly as possible on the problem that they're trying to address. So, rather than just giving a subsidy for something that may be related to how much pollution people create, you should give a tax directly on the pollution that causes the harm itself. So a big contrast to this is a lot of the interventions that were taken during the financial crisis. So during the financial crisis, the government wanted banks to lend more. And so what they did is they thought, banks weren't lending because because they didn't have enough money, so let's give some money, let's bail out the banks, and that'll get them lending again, right? An alternative approach would have been to subsidize them lending to people, right? That would have been giving money for doing the thing that is valued. Another example of this is that a lot of economists have advocated, in order to try to get the economy going again, in order to get people spending more money and employing more people, just giving tax breaks to companies or to individuals. But not tax breaks for hiring or tax breaks for spending money, just tax breaks overall in the hope that if they have more money, they'll spend more. This is a bit crazy as a way to get people to spend more money. If you want to get people to spend more money, give them money for spending money. Don't give them money and hope that they spend it, right? Something that makes a lot more sense is to have a cyclically adjusted sales tax, where during the bad times, suddenly the whole country is on sale, and everything is selling for 40% less, and then during good times, everything is selling for more. Okay. Now, imagine that I discover a giant stash of gold, and this causes the world gold prices to fall, and that makes everyone who currently owns gold worse off. Hee-sun Kim? No? Anyone else want to tell me if this is an externality or not? Sorry, remind me of your name? Suraj.
It's not an externality, it's just the market working, so when supply increase, like prices fall, so it's within the market, so it's not an externality.
Yeah, so more specifically, that's absolutely right. But the reason it's not an externality is that if I come in and I hurt all the other gold producers by lowering the price of gold, I also help everyone who wants to buy jewelry because the prices of gold goes down. So for every dollar that the gold producers get hurt, the gold consumers benefit, right? And the reason is this is mediated through the price system, as Sharaj said, right? Any time an externality I cause is mediated through the price system, it happens through the adjustment in prices, it's not a real externality. It's just what we call a pecuniary externality. And many of the most common misapplications of the theory of externalities come from the fact that people fail to understand this distinction and therefore think certain things are externalities that aren't really externalities. And therefore they advocate intervention even when it's not called for. So for example, imagine that one company comes into the industry and lowers the prices by competing, and that makes all the other companies worse off. That's not an externality, right? Because the consumers benefit just as much as the companies are hurt. Now, Eric, what if, rather than lowering the prices, the new company that came in, just took profitable sales away from the other companies, but didn't actually lower the prices? Would that be an externality or not?
How would they?
So for example, imagine that a company comes into an industry, there's currently a monopoly in the industry, and now the new company comes in and they collude with them, but they just split the sales, whereas there used to just be one company before the price is the same. Is that an externality or not?
Yeah, because the consumers aren't benefiting.
Exactly right. So consumers don't benefit. It's only the other firm that's harmed. And the reason is I didn't change the price. This wasn't mediated through the price system. It was mediated through me directly stealing the sales, right? And so that is not a pecuniary externality. It's a real externality. On the other hand, you know, if we have free trade with China and China exports things to the United States, that might cause some steel worker to lose their job. But the reduction in the price that they get for their labor is a benefit to the other people who might potentially employ them. And so it's not a real externality. If I pollute a lake, and that causes the fish in the lake to die, and that causes the price of fish to rise, that's not a pecuniary, that's just a pecuniary externality. It's not a real externality, because the higher price of the fish benefits other people who produce those fish. But it seems very clear that polluting the lake is a direct externality on somebody. So, Chan Yun? Does anyone else have a guess of who the real victim of the externality is? Yeah, go ahead.
Like fish lovers or fishermen or aficionados, people who care about the environment. People who are
Yes,
involved in this
yeah,
kind of
it is a direct externality on them. So if somebody just like loves fish, what's your name again? Matt. That's a good point. What do you think of
The
it?
guy that gets cancer for eating fish?
What is it?
Not if the price of fish falls enough to compensate him for that. Yeah, Elaine.
It's the people who live around the lake because they're not benefiting from the pollution at all.
Not quite. Anyone else want to give it a try? What's your name again? Michael.
The people who own the lake are
Exactly right. Okay. That's the right answer. So the people who own the lake, or imagine there's fishermen who have like an exclusive right to fish, so they like basically own the fish in the lake, they're the ones who are directly harmed by that, because it's their fish that are being destroyed. And this sort of thing can happen even when there's not a literal marketplace, even when there's just a figurative marketplace. So imagine that your roommate, who's brilliant, gets stoned, and as a result, you do better on the curve of the exam, right? Now, that is not really a positive externality, it's just a pecuniary externality, because while it benefits you because you have less competition, it harms me because my students do less well overall, right? And similarly, selective abortions of women, which are very common in East Asia and South Asia do not actually create positive real externalities for the other women who are now able to get better men. Because the men are just as much worse off than as the women are better off, right? Because in the market for mates, the price of those women goes up, and that hurts the men and benefits the women. And this distinction might seem like an esoteric economic distinction, but it actually shows up all over the law. So there's a very famous distinction between physical and purely economic damages. So if you hit a doctor in your car, or if you burn down somebody's house, or if you defame somebody else's character, those are all, if not physical, at least direct harms to those individuals. And you have to pay damages for doing that. However, you don't have to pay damages for causing purely economic losses. So for example, if the patients of that doctor who you hit with your car no longer have a doctor to go to and have to go to another doctor, that benefits the new doctor they go to as much as it harms them, and so the overall value is zero. So there's no pecuniary externality to them, there's only the direct externality on the doctor. If the value of other homes in a neighborhood rises because the home burned down and therefore the housing stock is more scarce, that harms just as much the people who are buying as it helps the people who are selling, right? But on the other hand, imagine that actually causes the price of houses in the neighborhood to go down because that house was so beautiful that now that it's gone, everybody else in the neighborhood is sad. That was an externality. Because it took away that externality, that is a real externality on everybody else. So these things are very subtle, and we're going to go through a bunch of examples to try to calibrate your intuition to them. So these basically pure economic losses are exactly the same as pecuniary externalities. They're indirect, price-mediated harms. And this was a huge issue for the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So for
What's your name?
like cool. So if the home values fall, would that mean like the buyers would benefit then? If the home buyers?
No, because the home buyers won't benefit because they won't have the house to look at either.
Oh, okay.
You see what I mean? It falls exactly in correspondence with how much worse it is for them.
Okay.
So the Deepwater Horizon disaster, when there was this giant oil spill, caused all these problems, right? And it was a really big issue, which things are pure economic damages and which things are actual physical damages. And I want to go through some examples and see if you guys can figure them out. So, Vidor, what do you think? Were the shrimping employees, like the people who worked in the shrimping industry, did they only receive pure economic losses, or do you think they were physically damaged by this spill?
They were physically damaged, right? Because they lost their jobs.
Well, so what really happened, right, is that their wage went down. That made them cheaper for someone else to hire.
Okay,
And so they were not physically damaged. So it was a pure economic damage. Second, see me out. The government conservation agency, which is in charge of protecting birds, was it purely economically harmed, or was it directly harmed by the disaster?
Oh, I don't really know the Deepwater Horizon. So
Well, okay, so there's a giant oil spill. There's a government agency that has the responsibility of protecting the birds.
Okay.
And they're sort of in charge of conservation. Do they suffer a pure economic loss, or do they suffer a physical loss when there's a bunch of pollution that kills all the birds?
I think there's some form of physical damage.
Yeah,
I mean,
explain why.
because the birds are dead, it's some physical damage to them, because they're supposed to be in charge of protecting birds or
Yeah.
was okay.
Effectively, they own the birds, right? Like they're in charge of owning the birds on behalf of society for the benefit of the public, right? So their job is to take care of the birds, right? And those birds die. It's sort of like a zoo. If someone comes and like shoots all the animals in the zoo, that is a physical damage to the zoo, right? How about Louisiana hotels serving the shrimping industry? Like people came down and stayed at the hotels when they had business meetings, and now the shrimping industry's dead, and they can no longer do that. What do you think, David? Whoa. Yeah.
Wouldn't this be like the pollution example?
So you think it's which?
Maybe physical.
You think it's a physical loss? What do you think, Edward?
It's not just like an economic loss because even though like they're serving the shrimp, like it's just like it's, the price of shrimp went down, so the quantity is just gonna go down.
Yeah. Well,
it's not
so
really,
and who benefits? Who
Yeah,
benefits on the other side? Well, the person who wants to come and take a vacation in Louisiana, right? Because now the price of the hotel, which used to be serving the industry, is now much lower, and it's really cheap to stay at that hotel, and so the consumers benefit. Vrushan, what about shippers through the port in Louisiana?
So the shippers wouldn't have a job anymore, but the quality of their labor would go down, so they would be cheaper to hire by someone else.
Well, so the problem is that the port, you don't pay anything in order to access the port.
Oh, okay.
If there was someone who owned the port, then
Oh, then
their
it's-
price would go down and the other people
It's-
wouldn't receive a real damage.
Physical damage.
So because they don't pay anything for the port, they effectively own part of the port.
Okay.
The right to go into the port, and so they're physically damaged. Okay, so what we've just showed is that not everything where I end up hurting someone else is a real externality. But it's also the case that not everything that I do to myself is just fine and efficient. Individuals often neglect or ignore or impose undue costs on themselves in the future or even now. So these types of effects are called internalities, and rather than policies addressing them being called externality policy, they're called paternalism. So the idea is very similar to in a market. If there are things that you should be taking into account about how they hurt you, you should do that. Or if they things that you should be taking into account about how they help you, you should do more of that. And in fact, large areas of public policy are determined not by externalities, but by internalities. So all the policies we have about drug addiction and regulating drugs are about internality policy. Because many people believe that addicts would be better if they quit, rather than if they keep using the drug. And this justifies sin taxes, prohibitions of using drugs, etc. Also, we often require people or subsidize people saving for their retirement because we think that people will be tempted not to save enough and to spend the money today. Yeah?
Is it just like they'd be better off from like a health-wise or
Well-
lifestyle-wise? I mean, like, how is that?
I mean, I'm not saying I believe this,
Okay.
but I'm saying a lot of people do believe that. I mean, a lot of people think that the addicts are doing things that are not in their own interest. That basically they're serving their like short-term desires, and that what would be good for them in the long run. And we talk like this all the time, right? So like people always talk about you need to be strong, have willpower, work harder now because it'll be good for you in the long term, right? And that you're not doing enough of that, and that and I think we almost all have the feeling of sort of fighting with ourselves over things that we know we should be doing and things that we're tempted to do, right? Yeah.
It seems like the idea of an internality has to assume that individuals aren't completely rational, maybe, because they're not making the optimal choice for the
Well, I
situation.
think it's complicated to think of what one means by rationality in this context, because at the moment, you might really want to do something and very rationally pursue that goal, even though it's not in your interest in the long term. So imagine that I'm a cocaine addict, and I'm like desperately searching after cocaine. right? I might be really, really smart about ways to get cocaine. I might figure out how to rob a store or whatever. But in the long term, it's really not in my interest to do any of that
But-
stuff.
Like
So-
maybe a truly rational individual though would try to optimize the utility across like the long run. Is what I'm saying.
Well, it's an interesting question, but I think it's hard to make that. If you're really interested in this, you should come to my lecture this afternoon from 1:30 to 2:50, because I'm talking all about this. But I mean, I think it's really hard to make that argument because, so why should you? There's actually this beautiful book called Reasons and Persons. It's all about this. So why should you care more about yourself in 50 years than you care about Amanda? Amanda is sitting right next to you right now. Shouldn't you look out just as much for her interest as you do for yourself?
Well, I'm
in
going to
50
turn into that 50-year-old person, but I'm not going to turn into Amanda.
Well, what does it mean for you to turn into? I mean, the thing is, it's not exactly you. Like, all the cells in your body will be different. I mean, it's very, if you start going down that road, you start thinking, well, in exactly what sense am I the same person as I will be in 50 years? That you're very temporally separated. That person might have all sorts of different views. Imagine you knew that yourself in 50 years would have exactly the opposite set of values from what you do now. So, like, imagine that you were a communist and you believed in. You could very well know, because of various historical forces, that in 50 years you're going to be an investment banker. And you might actually right now want to occupy yourself in 50 years, right? Because you actually support Occupy Wall Street. And you might absolutely hate the person you're going to be in 50 years. Whereas you might think Amanda's a perfectly nice person, right? And so you might actually... So it's not at all clear that you look out for the interests of yourself in 50 years any more than you look out for the person sitting next to you right now. There's a lot of argument to be made that person's actually more related to you than yourself in 50 years is. So I think it's pretty hard to sustain that sort of a view. Anyway, you should look at this book by Parfit. It's on the reading list. It's a very good book. Energy efficiency standards are another classic paternalistic idea which is justified by this type of an analysis. So Alcott and Wozni show that consumers don't respond fully to the energy savings that they could get by buying a more fuel-efficient car, and therefore the people who buy the car are actually worse off than they would be if they were forced to buy a more efficient car. And this is used to justify CAFE standards, which most economists would say are not a very efficient... Sorry, does everyone know what CAFE standards are? No. So CAFE standards require that all of the cars of a company have to average out to a certain amount of fuel economy. So they have to have some average miles per gallon. That's right. And this is not really the efficient way to deal with pollution or with anything like that, because you should just put a direct tax on whatever it is that's causing the harm. This is obviously addressed more at dealing with the fact that consumers don't make the right decisions about which type of cars to buy. And so it tries to force them to buy more efficient cars. And in fact, what Alcott and Wozni find is that the benefit that brings to consumers is an order of magnitude bigger than the benefit it brings to the environment. So those things are overwhelmingly designed to help consumers and not to help the environment. Another example might be suicide. We don't let people commit suicide because we think that has externalities on their future self. Even though they at this moment don't want to be alive, they're killing someone in the future who is not necessarily themselves exactly, it's their self in the future, right? I know this is all very strange because it's very easy to fall into this thing of thinking, I am just this coherent thing, across time, but it's not really obvious that that's actually the case. Organ donation is similar to this. It's usually illegal to sell your organs or to become a prostitute because we think that might impose all sorts of costs on yourself in the future that you're not fully taking into account right now. Okay, so this is an example. So Alcott and Wozni looked at when the price of fuel changes and therefore the value of having a car that's more fuel efficient changes, how much do people change their purchasing behavior of different things? And what they should do is reduce the amount they're willing to pay for really inefficient cars by a lot, and increase what they're willing to pay for the most efficient cars by a lot. But in fact, they don't do that, so this is what people actually do, and the red line is what people should do if they were fully taking into account the increased value of having the more efficient car. And this leads them to pay something like $1,000 too little for the most efficient cars and $1,000 too much for the least efficient cars. Okay, so most economists' favorite response to externalities is to impose a tax if the activity is harmful and a subsidy if the activity is beneficial. And this is sort of the simplest solution because it directly creates a price, either positive or negative, for the activity. And the tax has to be equal to the marginal social cost of the activity at the optimal level. That's exactly what Amanda's diagram showed, right? Otherwise, it's not going to play the same role as price, right? It should be playing the role of price, which is that it's always equal to the marginal cost or the marginal benefit. However, the problems can arise because this level, setting just the level of the marginal thing, may not be sufficient to solve the problem. So, like, an example of this is fax machines. So fax machines are only valuable if other people are using fax machines. So everyone who buys a fax machine creates a positive externality for everyone else who currently has a fax machine. But imagine, like, in the early 80s, there was only like 100 people who had a fax machine. So the marginal externality of one more person using a fax machine is very, very small, right? However, as more people got it, it became more valuable. And this meant that it took a long time for the market for fax machines to take off, and that wouldn't have really been solved by just subsidizing it at the current marginal externality. Because the real externality that it was going to end up causing once enough people got it and it was efficient was going to be much larger than that. So it's better to actually subsidize by the marginal externality at the efficient level, or even more than that early on, when there are little benefits to getting the fax machine, and that'll bring you to the efficient level, and then at that point you can just subsidize at the marginal externality. And in fact, this is exactly what a lot of internet companies do. So internet companies like Facebook run systems that are very similar to the fax machine. It's only worth participating if everyone participates. So they usually lose money early on. They don't have advertisements. They don't charge anything to build up a base. And then once they get to an efficient level, well, then they charge something that's closer to just the marginal externality. So this strategy of losing money early on and making it up later, giving a really big subsidy early, and then charging just the marginal externality as a subsidy later, is called the insulating tariff. Okay. Now, the most common practical application of this type of subsidy or tax is taxes on pollution. So, Lawrence White advocated that rather than your cars being required to meet a certain smog standard regardless of where you live, it should depend on where you actually live, because people who live in rural areas, the smog doesn't create much of a problem. People who live in cities, it creates a terrible problem. And so every time you go to get your car assessed, it should be based on an assessment of how much externality it's causing that you're driving around that place. Similarly, the French government puts a little filter above all smokestacks and all power plants and measures all the types of chemicals that are coming out, and then for each one of them charges a tax to force people to internalize the externality. And we'll talk a lot more about this on Thursday, but there's a big push, and currently in Europe they're already doing it, to put in carbon taxes to tax the amount of carbon that you pollute and that thereby warms up the earth. Now, almost all economists think that the taxation is better than directly regulating, like saying this factory has to emit no more than this much, this factory has to emit no more than this much, which was the classic solution. And Kenneth, why do you think economists prefer the tax solution over the direct regulation?
Because then firms will decide like how much they want like to produce. I mean, how much they are like able to afford that tax.
Yeah, so that's right. So the firms that have that are most able to reduce the amount they're polluting will reduce it by a lot. The firms that are less able to reduce the amount they're polluting will reduce it by much less, right? And so Margaret Fowley and her co-authors found that there's a big problem, that the way that we deal with nitrogen oxide is that we prohibit companies from producing NOx, but we don't have any regulations that make cars pay for how much NOx they're creating. And as a result of that, cars could reduce NOx much more cheaply than the companies, than the power plants could. And so what they find is that if you had some just tax on producing NOx, rather than like regulating the companies and leaving the cars unregulated, you could reduce the cost of keeping this current level of nitrous oxide by $2 billion. Okay, so to go back to Amanda's graph, and I just want to draw it a little bit bigger. So if we have, here's the marginal private value, here's the marginal social cost, a Pigouvian tax just says, okay, here's the marginal externality. Now we can eliminate the social cost curve, and we can just set a price that's here, right, a tax, and then the market will always produce the optimal level, right? If we just set a tax there, the market does the same thing as if it directly took into account the cost. Okay. Now, in the United States, most Pigouvian taxes are actually collected through the legal system. That is, when a firm does something harmful, they get sued. And the court then assesses how large the harm was, and they're forced to pay two types of damages usually, or at least sometimes. Compensatory damages that directly compensate the harm that they caused. And the second type is punitive damages, which are usually paid at least partly to the government rather than to the person. And these deal with the fact that it's hard to bring a lawsuit, and therefore people don't bring lawsuits against everything harmful that's being done. That means that if you do something harmful to someone else, there's only some chance that you're going to get detected, and you'll have to pay the fine. It's not going to be 100%. Maybe you only 1/4 of the time end up getting a lawsuit brought against you. And so if only 1/4 of the time you get the lawsuit brought against you, then you might do too much of the activity. To make you bear the full costs of it, you have to say, well, I'm only going to be caught 1/4 of the time, but in that 1/4 of the time, I might have to pay 4 times the harm that I caused. And so that'll even out to the right amount of the right amount of payment. Another reason why some of the money might get paid to the government rather than to the person who brought the lawsuit is that you want to incentivize people not to be reckless. So people might get into a car with a drunk person if they know that they can sue that drunk person and get back all the damages caused to them. And we want to incentivize people not to put themselves in situations where they're going to be harmed by other people. So we might not want to give them the full compensation for the harm that was caused. And you'll be dealing with this a lot more on your problem set. So the Anglo-Saxon legal system basically incorporates the idea of pigou almost directly, right? Just the whole idea is that you have to pay for the harms that you cause. And that's exactly Pagu's principle. And the idea behind the common law, which is the Anglo-Saxon system, is that not everything can be covered in government statutes. It's just too hard for government to charge taxes for or find other Pigouvian solutions to all problems, right? There's just too many problems for the government to write enough laws. On the other hand, the Europeans think that we have way too many lawsuits, and they write many, many, many more laws and regulate things much, much more specifically than we do. And these are sort of two different ways of dealing with the externality problems. The US believes much more in paying for the cost that you impose on other people. The Europeans believe much more in directly regulating certain behaviors to be illegal. So they're much more similar to the solution that economists are sort of skeptical of, which is the direct regulation that just says you can't do this, you can't do this. Whereas the US system is much more similar to the economist solution. So even though a lot of right-wing people say that we have way too many lawsuits, in some ways that exactly reflects the fact that we're using a much more market-oriented system than the Europeans are. So instead of mandating a particular quantity, price that we place on an activity, you could also mandate a quantity and then allow people to trade. For example, you could auction off the right to pollute. You could say anytime you pollute, you need to have this little certificate that says it was okay for me to pollute. And you can auction off the right to those permits. Or you could say anyone who doesn't build a beautiful house has to have a permit, right? And then you could auction off the right to those for a negative externality, for a positive externality. So let's return to the smoking example. So Pigou would put a tax of $0.9, on each cigarette, but an alternative would be to cap the total number of cigarettes sold at 55,000, which is the efficient number, right? So now imagine that the supply of cigarettes were perfectly inelastic at 55,000, and that the demand were given by what we just did before, which was 5 times 3 minus the price, right? That's the demand function that just comes out of that equation over there. What would the equilibrium price of cigarettes be, David King?
So equilibrium price. So you would do the exact opposite of what you did originally. So the original price was $3, I believe.
Yep.
So
Or it was.
what was it?
It was $1. The price was $1, and then there was 99-cent tax.
Right. So
And here's the inelastic supply and the market equilibrium price.
okay. So would it be the case that if that 99-cent tax led to the optimal amount of production at 55,000,
Yeah.
then if you regulated the quantity at 55,000, then the price would end up being $1.99?
Yeah, 190. Yeah.
$1.90.
Exactly. So you can see that just plugging this in here, right? You get 1.9 as the you say 55,000 is equal to 150 minus 50,000p, and that leads to a price of 1.9. So there's an exact equivalence, at least in this simple situation, between the cap and the tax, right? And this is generally true because of the definition of market optimality. As David said, if we charge the right price, that leads to the optimal quantity. If we have the right quantity, that has to occur at the right price. These things are completely equivalent to one another. It's exactly the same as what we talked about last class, that the social planner implementing the optimal quantity is exactly the same as there being the right price. Okay, so this is commonly proposed for pollution that we should give people give out permits and then allow people to trade these. And what would happen is the people who are most efficient at reducing their pollution will sell their permits to the people who are less efficient. As long as this is set at the efficient level of total pollution, the price will be exactly the same as what the tax would be. And this is particularly obvious if rather than giving out the permits, we just held an auction, right? Where people could buy the permits, and the price that would occur at the auction is going to be exactly the same as the tax that would be imposed, right? But this is often proposed instead of a tax, precisely to avoid doing an auction. So the idea is you give the permits to the people who are hurt and who would therefore oppose you politically in imposing the tax, right? So it's basically a way to buy off people who would be politically opposed to the system. This is hard to do with taxes. I mean, in principle, you could charge a Pigouvian tax, raise some revenue, and then just give out the money as bribes to the people who would be opposed to you. But this would look pretty blatantly corrupt, right? So instead, what the government usually does, is proposing doing, is giving out these permits. Now, these permits are exactly the same as cash, because you can sell them for the equilibrium price in the market, but somehow it looks more fair than just giving out tax revenue. But putting aside the political logic, let's think about whether there's an economic reason why we might want one versus the other. So the basic problem is when you set a tax or when you set a quantity, you don't necessarily know exactly what the private demand and supply are going to be like. You don't know what this private marginal value is going to be like, right? So if the marginal externality created is independent of the amount of the tax, of the quantity that's created, it makes a lot of sense to use a tax. So that is, if the marginal cost of the externality is completely flat, it doesn't matter how much is being produced, or if the marginal cost of reducing the quantity is very large, is very inelastic, so that if you reduce it by much more, it's going to cost a huge amount. If you reduce it by much less, it's going to cost, it's also going to be very cheap to do that. Then it's going to make a lot of sense to use the tax, because that lets the market determine the total quantity more efficiently. So an example of this is, imagine that you're doing something like making noise that's driving your neighbor crazy. It doesn't really matter how many people in the country are doing that, right? Every time someone does that, it causes a certain amount of harm to their neighbor. It's not like we want to regulate the total amount of driving your neighbor crazy to be a certain amount across the country, and then have people trade the right to drive their neighbor crazy. That wouldn't make any sense, because the externality cause it's just completely elastic. It just is one unit, no matter who does it, it doesn't aggregate across the country. On the other hand, think about smoking. Smoking might get worse as more people do it, but the problem is that if we put a cap on the total amount of smoking, there might be some people who are addicts for whom it would be incredibly costly to quit smoking, right? And so it doesn't make sense to put a cap on the total amount of smoking allowed. It makes a lot more sense to put a tax on smoking so that people can figure out the right amount to adjust, so we don't force the people who just can't quit to quit, because that would be very inefficient. And this is the reason why the tort system is used for most small local externalities, because they don't accumulate over the whole country, and so it doesn't make sense to put a cap or regulation on them. On the other hand, if the optimal quantity to deal with the externalities is known very clearly, it makes a lot more sense to put a cap on the quantity. So, for example, if the marginal externality is extremely steep, because things just go to hell if you do have even a little bit more than a certain quantity, or if it's very elastic how much it costs to mitigate in the private sector, then you want to use a quantity control. So an example of this is congestion on a road. So a road is basically completely fine until when there's like, getting up to a certain number of people there. But as soon as it goes over like the threshold where it really gets congested, then everything goes to hell. And basically, the value of being on the road like drops to zero almost immediately, right? Because you're just stuck. I'm sure everyone who's driven much has experienced that, right? On the other hand, and in that case, it makes a lot of sense to just put a cap on the number of people that are allowed to be on the road rather than a price for being on the road. That's why tolls don't work that well. During busy times, it's terrible. During other times, it doesn't matter that someone's on the road. So they don't make a lot of sense. It makes much more sense to put like a total cap on how many people can be on the road at any given time. On the other hand, it didn't make a lot of sense to put a tax on having lead in gasoline and instead to just mandate that cars don't have any lead, because the cost of reducing the lead that's in the gasoline is very flat. It's just, there's a certain amount that it costs to take the lead out of the gasoline, and that doesn't depend on how much of it is in there. So let me show you this on the graph. So suppose on the one hand, we were to have very flat private value and very steep social costs. In this case, we would expect that it's much more efficient to set a price, to set a quantity rather than a price, right? And so how do we see that? Well, imagine that we don't quite know what the private demand looks like. It could be this. It could be that. If we set a quantity, then in these cases we only get this very small deadweight loss triangle, right? This is what we end up producing, and this would be what is efficient, and so we get a small deadweight loss area there. On the other hand, if we had set the price here, right, we would get this huge deadweight loss area here. And that would be very, very inefficient. On the other hand, if the private value is very inelastic and the social value, social cost is quite elastic, then it should be much more efficient to set a price rather than a quantity, right? So if we set a price, we only get this little deadweight loss area here, whereas if we set a quantity, we get this huge deadweight loss area here. Right? So the more elastic is the private value relative to the social value, the more we want a quantity. The more elastic is the social value relative to the private value, the more we want to use a tax or a price. Now, everything that I've been talking about so far is sort of a public or government-led solution. But some people have suggested that we don't really need to use the government to solve these types of problems, that as long as the property rights are clear, people in the private sector can just come to an efficient bargain about the situation. So imagine you're making a lot of noise at night, and your neighbor hates this. Now, the efficient outcome is that maybe you make a little bit of noise, listen to your music less, but not no noise at all, right? Because you value listening to music quite a bit. He values not being driven crazy, so you should come to somewhere in between. Now, if he has the right, if you have the right to make as much noise as you want, right? Then what he can do is he can pay you to shut off your music, to turn it down. He says, look, okay, I understand you have the right to do it, but I'll pay you to reduce the amount of music. On the other hand, if you have an absolute right to quiet and he can't listen to anything unless you give him permission, then then it makes sense for him to pay you for all the noise that he makes, right? And either way, you're going to reach the efficient outcome, which is you should have some amount of noise, but not a lot, right? So why do you need the government to come in and impose a tax for the noise? Basically, even when it's not clear who has the absolute right to the noise or not, you almost always have some sort of de facto property, right? So basically, there's some norm that you have about how much noise is a reasonable amount, and if you want to get past that, you make some agreement with the person. Somebody pays somebody else, and you reach the efficient arrangement. So shouldn't all problems of externalities just solve themselves this way? Anytime anyone's causing a problem for someone else, they can always get together and someone can make some payment to the other person. So this argument is called Stigler's Coase theorem. It's also sometimes called Coase's theorem and the Coase theorem, but I like to call it Stigler's Coase theorem because Coase basically didn't believe this, but Stigler attributed it to him. And so sort of the most correct name is probably Stigler's Coase theorem. So, and it says that if people can costlessly get together and bargain with one another to figure out the efficient outcome, then we always get efficiency, regardless of the initial allocation of property rights, as long as they're defined. And as long as income effects are small, that is, the efficient level doesn't depend too much on who has the right, then the outcome is independent of the assignment of property rights. So the problem is, what do we mean by it's easy for us to get together and make an agreement with one another? Basically, all that's meant by that is anything that gets in the way of us making an efficient agreement with one another. So another way to put this thing is that it's just saying that if we can efficiently agree with one another, then efficiency arises, right? So it's just a tautology, basically. Another way of stating it would be to say, all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, right? So if the world is perfect, then everything will turn out okay. Nonetheless, the idea that bargaining may help us get to efficiency can be useful in some cases. So for example, bargaining usually works well when there's a very small number of information that's relevant. And when the two people can find one another very easily, like you and your roommate. And this is the reason why mergers sometimes can be used to facilitate efficient arrangements. So, for example, a condominium association owns all of the condominium. That's what a condo is. Owns actually all the condos. And you don't actually own your condo. You just own a share in the condominium association. And the reason that they do that is because that gets everyone to try to take into account all the effects they're having on other people. Similarly, like when a company owns a company town, they have a stake in everything that goes on there. And that leads them to internalize a lot of the externalities that are caused. Similarly, cooperative firms, by being owned by the consumers that they have externalities on, they take into account their interests. And the European Union, though it's not clear whether it's doing this so well, the idea was that all of them would be setting their policies to take into account the externalities they had on other people. Greece doesn't seem to have realized that. But mergers don't obviously always work, because as we talked about in lecture 2, there are still conflicts even within companies, right? Just because two things are part of the same company doesn't mean that some people don't do some things to hurt other people within the company. And as we talked about earlier today, it's not clear that people don't do things that harm themselves. So even combining everything into one person doesn't necessarily solve the problem, right? If the externality is not a real externality, it's just a pecuniary externality, actually the merger can make things worse. So this is particularly true when there's one group that can easily merge with each other, and another group, like consumers, that can't. So like competing companies exert pecuniary but not real externalities on one another. They might merge together, form a cartel, right, and harm consumers. The consumers find it hard to get together and form a group, and therefore that can lead actually to things being worse than if they didn't combine to deal with those externalities. Industry-wide lobby groups, or things like the American Medical Association, are another example of that. Or more informally, in the sort of things we were talking about, packs of popular girls in high school can sort of band together and exert the sort of market power over in the mate market that drives crazy all the guys in the school, right? So the monopolistic, sometimes the private sector can solve these problems precisely by creating a monopoly. So, for example, when there's a monopoly control over something like faxes, that can actually be helpful to a large extent because they have an interest in seeing the fax machine succeed, because they'll be able to make a profit off of that eventually, right? And so the problem in the United States with the fax machine, why it took so long to get going, is that nobody had sort of responsibility for it. Nobody was interested in subsidizing it in the short term in order to try to get it up to scale so that the market would take off. An example of this is, newspapers are usually very much subsidized or even offered free to consumers to internalize the benefits to the advertisers of people reading the newspaper. And if there wasn't someone who could make a profit off of those advertisers, those newspapers wouldn't be produced and made available because they're costly to print. Now, the monopolists can often be useful in the short run, especially if they realize this could be a great product, it could really create a lot of value, let me subsidize it in the short term in order to create value in the long term. It can help the market get over the hump and get it established. That can be true both in sort of these network externality cases I was talking about, but also in cities. Often cities will make a big investment at a large cost to create an industrial cluster that will create lots of benefits because they'll make it back in tax revenue later. But the problem is that in the long term, the monopoly is always going to charge a higher price than a competitive market would. The competitive market will usually charge a price somewhere around the average price, whereas the average cost, whereas the monopolist is always going to charge a price that allows them to make a profit. And so in the long run, even though the monopoly can be useful to get things going, in the long run, the monopoly is always going to charge too high of a price. Okay, so I think that despite some of the potential benefits of these private solutions, the Coase theorem, the idea that you can always solve these problems privately, is usually misleading. And the reason is that, even if your neighbor and you could bargain over the right solution, you could also have imposed a tax on you making noise, and you still could have bargained to the right solution, right? So there's nothing about the tax that makes anything less efficient. All it's saying is that no matter where you start, you can always bargain to efficiency. And the good thing about the Pigouvian intervention is it means that in case you can't bargain, you can always fall back on the Pigouvian solution. The bigger problem is that many externalities affect a ton of people in a very, very diffuse way. And this makes bargaining very difficult. So imagine if everyone on the planet who was affected by climate change got together in a room and tried to reach a bargain about what the efficient solution would be. That would almost certainly be a total disaster because you just have to talk to too many people. It would take forever. It would be completely impossible, right? And more importantly, the information needed to figure out what's the efficient level of climate change is very diffuse. If I went around and polled everyone in this room or everyone all over the planet about what's the efficient level of greenhouse gases, they would have absolutely no idea, right? Because even the scientists who figure out these things do it based on 1,000 different scientific studies and talking to all these different scientists. Each individual person has very little information, so it doesn't work very well to just get everyone together and have them figure it out, right? So bargaining can only be as good as the information of the people who are involved in the bargaining is. So the real question about a market failure is not, can people bargain to efficiency, but rather who is it that knows best and most clearly what the efficient outcome and solution is. And the Coase theorem, therefore, really doesn't tell us whether an intervention is good or bad. It just reminds us that bargaining may help improve things, but that as much as possible, we have to find the way to get the right information together. So the real problem that faces us is how do we get the right information? And this is really going to be the theme of the next class. Typically, the information is diffused across lots of different people with different expertise. And the problem of designing the right externality policy is how to combine all the different information. And in doing this, there's going to be a lot of trade-offs that are going to be crucial. And the relative importance of different people's information is going to be the key determinant of policy. Simplistic answers like the Coase theorem would just say, leave it and everything will sort itself out, really ignore these problems. And hopefully the next class will help guard you against that sort of naive response. So thanks. And I hope you enjoy the next